They tied his frail body to a wooden hurdle, not with care or pity, but with the same cold detachment one might show a sack of grain bound for market. And as the old man was dragged through the mud and gravel streets of Glastonbury, the townspeople watched in a silence that weighed heavier than any sermon ever preached within the abbey's ancient walls. For this was no thief, no murderer, no rebel prince. This was Richard Whiting, a man of God, nearly 80 years of age, whose only crime was holding fast to the stones and silence of a sacred place, and whose fate, on that cold November morning in the year 1539, I would stain the land with more than blood. It would stain it with shame that centuries would not wash away. He had once been the voice of peace in a realm unraveling, chosen by his brothers not through ambition, but reverence. When in the year 1525, the old abbot died, and a replacement was needed to guide the great Glastonbury Abbey, a place whose history reached back through centuries, a place older than kings, richer than barons, and holier, perhaps, than any crown. And so they chose Richard, quiet and devout, a man more likely to kneel than to command. Yet under his careful hand, the abbey had flourished, its monks fed, its lands managed with grace, and its name whispered with respect in both village hearths and noble halls. For Glastonbury was not merely a monastery, it was a symbol, a sanctuary, and for some, even a final thread that connected England to the holy past. But the king was changing everything. Henry VIII of his name, who had once stood tall as defender of the faith, now stood in direct defiance of the Pope himself, his appetite for wives having torn him from Rome and into a new vision of sovereignty where he, not Christ's vicar, would wear the mantle of sacred authority. And to fund this new church of the crown, Thomas Cromwell, that ruthless architect of royal ambition, began what would become known as the dissolution of the monasteries, a policy cloaked in righteousness, but driven by greed. And so abbey after abbey fell, its walls broken, its altars desecrated, its relics scattered like old bones at the feet of a king who needed more gold. By the year 1539, nearly all the religious houses in Somerset had been shuttered, their monks turned into beggars, their chapels abandoned to ivy and ruin, all save one, Glastonbury, which still stood, proud and defiant atop its sacred hill, the last sanctuary, the final thorn in the crown's flesh, and at its helm stood Richard Whiting, now an old man, weathered by time but not bent by fear, still wearing the robes of office and still offering prayers in Latin when most others had traded theirs for silence. The king had not forgotten him. Cromwell's agents arrived in September of that year, not with reverence but with suspicion. And when they found little treasure within the abbey walls, they assumed the worst, that it had been hidden, concealed from the king. And when vaults were broken and bricks pulled from ancient mortar, they uncovered what they had hoped for: gold, plate, and coin, evidence enough to twist the truth into treason. Richard was arrested. He was taken first to the Tower of London, where the old stone whispered of executions past, where Anne Boleyn's laughter once echoed, and Thomas More's silence still lingered. And there he was questioned, not as a man but as a symbol, a relic to be broken. And Cromwell himself, that black-eyed clerk turned kingmaker, recorded in his diary the plans for Richard's fate. He would not simply be imprisoned, nor even beheaded as befitted a peer of the realm. He would be made an example. The trial was a shadow of justice. The charges were absurd: robbery of his own abbey, concealment of the king's treasure, harboring dangerous ideas, and yet they were delivered with such finality that no defense could stand against them. And in a quiet room, far from the cloisters he once walked, Richard was sentenced to die in the cruelest manner English law permitted. He was to be hanged, thrown, and quartered, a punishment reserved for traitors, a ritual of death so brutal that even executioners flinched. They brought him back to Glastonbury for the act itself, as if to complete the desecration of the sacred with the defilement of its guardian. He was dragged for miles, through wet fields and stone lanes, the hurdle bouncing over ruts, while his body jolted like a marionette abandoned in the mud. And behind him came two of his monks, Treasurer John Thorne and Roger James, both condemned to follow their master in death. And when they reached the Tor, the great hill that watched over the town like a sentinel, they were brought to the summit, where the gallows waited beneath the open sky. Richard was hanged until he neared death, but not so far as to miss what came next. They cut him down, still breathing. His genitals were severed and thrown into the fire. His belly was split, and his entrails drawn out, burned while his eyes still saw. His head was taken, his limbs divided, and then the remains of the elderly abbot, the man who once served peace, who fed the poor, who stood between his brothers and ruin, were sent to the four corners of the region, his arms and legs carted to Wells, Bath, Bridgewater, and Ilchester, while his head, the face now frozen in agony, was affixed above the west gate of the very abbey he once led. Not a rebellion, not a plot, just an old man, punished for refusing to hand over a key to a king who already held everything. And though the centuries have passed, and the torches burned out, and the gallows rotted, that November day remains a wound in the history of England, a day when a king proved that not even age, piety, or service could shield a man from cruelty. And when the faithful learned that their silence would not save them, only obedience, only surrender, only fear, that, in the reign of Henry VIII, was the price of devotion, long before the blood dried on the hill and the head was hoisted into the sky, long before the gallows were built or the hurdle dragged through mud. There was peace, a kind of quiet so profound that it hummed beneath the cloisters of Glastonbury Abbey like a prayer whispered by the stones themselves. In that hush, in that space untouched by war or politics or royal edicts, men lived not as servants of a king, but as servants of God, rising before the sun, chanting in unison, tending to gardens and books and souls, moving through the seasons with the rhythm of the bells and the slow turning of Scripture. At the heart of it all was Richard Whiting, a man not born to power or princely blood, but shaped by duty, silence, and a devotion carved over decades. First as a student, then as a deacon, a doctor of theology, and eventually, in the year 1525, as abbot chosen not by royal decree, but by the unanimous voice of his monastic brethren. He did not seek glory, and yet it came to him, in the form of a flourishing abbey, one of the wealthiest in England, a house, not of indulgence but of order, where the poor were fed, the sick tended, and pilgrims found solace among relics and legends so ancient they seemed older than memory itself. Glastonbury Abbey, perched in the gentle lands of Somerset, was no ordinary monastery. It was myth and sanctuary intertwined. Some said King Arthur had once been buried beneath its soil. Others believed the Holy Grail had passed through its halls. Whatever the truth, the people believed in it not just in its relics or its wealth, but in its presence, solid and eternal. A piece of sacred geography rooted too deep to be moved. And yet, the storm was already gathering. In the heart of London, in halls far removed from stone altars and candlelight, a different chant had begun, a chant of supremacy, reformation, and the king's will made flesh. Henry VIII, frustrated by Rome's refusal to annul his first marriage, had torn England from the Pope's embrace and declared himself supreme head of the Church. With that declaration came not just new prayers, but new laws, new punishments, and above all, new hungers for land, for gold, for authority that could not be questioned by bishop or abbot or God himself. It was in this atmosphere of divine reshuffling that Thomas Cromwell rose, a man with ink-stained fingers and eyes that never blinked, who saw monasteries not as holy ground, but as hoards of untapped wealth waiting to be claimed in the king's name. By the year 1539, Cromwell's men had swept through England like a plague in robes, closing down hundreds of abbeys, priories, and convents, seizing their treasures, destroying their libraries, scattering their monks to the wind. In some towns, the bells never rang again. In others, the altars were torn down, and their stones used to pave roads or build stables. The land groaned under the weight of this rupture. The poor, who once depended on the charity of monasteries, now found doors closed, fields fenced, bowls empty. Yet through all this upheaval, one place remained untouched, unbroken, still echoing with the sounds of prayer and peace. Glastonbury. It stood alone. Some said it was too holy to fall. Others whispered that its wealth was too vast, its influence too deep, and that perhaps even the king hesitated before pulling down so ancient a pillar. But in truth, the reason was simpler. Glastonbury had not given cause. Whiting had signed the Act of Supremacy, acknowledging the king as head of the church. His monks, too, had offered formal obedience. There were no riots here, no rebellious sermons, no letters to Rome or harboring of enemies. The abbey continued, as it always had, serene and obedient. Its doors open to pilgrims, its halls quiet and clean. But obedience was no shield against ambition. Peace was no armor against suspicion. And a crown's hunger could never be satisfied by mere compliance. It needed submission. It needed surrender. That summer, the rumors grew louder. In nearby towns, people spoke of Cromwell's agents eyeing Glastonbury with more than curiosity. At court, questions were whispered about the abbey's vast lands, its rumored hoards of silver plate, the scrolls in its library that defended Queen Catherine even after her fall from favor. And within the abbey itself, despite the calm routines, something had begun to shift, a quiet awareness, like the scent of smoke long before a fire is seen. Whiting, though aged, was not blind. He knew that peace was never permanent under a king who changed wives as often as seasons and who replaced saints with laws. He watched as the lesser monasteries fell, one by one, their abbots imprisoned or worse, and he must have wondered how long his sanctuary would last. Still, he refused to flee. Others might have melted into exile, retired into silence, or handed over their treasures in exchange for titles or safety. But Whiting did none of these. He stayed. Perhaps it was stubbornness, perhaps it was faith, or perhaps, at 80 years of age, a man no longer fears what lies at the end of the path he has walked all his life. Instead, he did what he had always done. He tended his abbey. He led the prayers. He met with his monks. He oversaw the harvest and the almsgiving. And he waited. Then, in September, they came, not with swords, but with scrolls, not with soldiers, but with questions. The royal commissioners, sent by Cromwell under the banner of investigation, arrived not to worship, but to dismantle. They poked through chambers. They opened vaults. They tapped walls, listening for the hollow echo of secrets. And when they found little at first, they pressed harder, convinced that wealth had been hidden. Soon, walls were broken, bricks pulled loose, and behind the stone silver, coin, goblets, and plates. It was enough. Enough to twist piety into conspiracy. Enough to claim concealment. Enough to drag an old man from his chapel and brand him a thief. But that would come later. For now, the calm remained deceptive. Heavy, like the stillness before thunder. The monks continued their chants. Though their voices wavered, the bells rang. Though they sounded more like warnings than calls to worship, Whiting still walked the cloisters, his robes brushing the same stones he had walked for decades. But behind him now were whispers, sidelong glances, and the heavy footfall of visitors who did not kneel. The storm had not yet broken, but its winds had begun to stir the veils, extinguish the candles, and steal the breath from every prayer. And yet, there was still something sacred in those final weeks, a beauty sharp in its fragility. The turning leaves, golden and rust, falling across the abbey grounds. The final harvest stacked in baskets, shared among villagers who still remembered kindness. The old hymns echoing through stone arches as twilight fell. Even the silence had weight, like the last page of a holy book before it is closed forever. Perhaps, in some divine way, Glastonbury knew it was ending. Perhaps that is why the air grew sweeter, why the monks lingered longer in the chapel, why even the birds fell quiet as they circled above the tor. A farewell, unspoken but understood. And Richard Whiting, elder of elders, Abbot of Peace, walked among it all upright, unhurried, and unafraid. They did not knock. They did not ask for bread, or water, or prayer. They arrived at Glastonbury Abbey, not like guests, nor even like conquerors, but like men who already believed themselves to be owners of the soil beneath their feet. They came with scrolls, not swords. But the damage they would do required no steel. They wore no armor, but their robes bore the seal of Thomas Cromwell. And that, in the England of the year 1539, was more dangerous than any drawn blade. The abbey had survived famine, fire, pestilence, and the ebb and flow of kings, but it could not survive ink and law twisted into tools of destruction by those who had forgotten the shape of mercy. There were 3 of them, though more would follow later. Their names do not matter, for they were not remembered. They were not the kind of men history chooses to honor or even blame. They were bureaucrats with soft hands and sharp eyes, trained not in scripture, but in suspicion. They carried lists, inventories, and warrants. They had been taught to listen not to music but to murmurs, to watch for the hesitations between words, to read every bow as potential disloyalty. When they entered the gates of Glastonbury, they saw not a holy place, but a ledger waiting to be corrected. The monks stood in their rows and watched. Some bowed. Some kept their eyes on the floor. None spoke. The abbot was absent that morning, perhaps already informed of their arrival. or perhaps simply unwilling to greet men who had come not in peace, but in judgment. The inspectors walked slowly, their boots echoing in the cloisters, trailing cold draughts in their wake. Every turn of their heads was deliberate, every glance a measure. They walked the perimeter of the church with the slow reverence of scavengers searching a battlefield after the war has already been lost. At first, they asked simple questions. Where is the treasury kept? How many relics remain? Who holds the keys to the vestry? To the archives? To the hidden spaces where confession met record and record met silence? Their voices never rose. They never shouted. They did not need to. The monks answered, softly, cautiously, as men do when wolves are in the garden. Nothing was out of order. The books were balanced. The beds were made. The bells still rang on time. If the inspectors felt frustrated by this lack of disorder, they did not show it. But something hung in the air, something just beyond sight. Perhaps it was the knowledge that Glastonbury was too perfect, too clean, too calm to be entirely without secrets. Perhaps it was the reputation of the abbey's long and quiet wealth. Or perhaps it was the simple certainty that no man could remain untouched when the crown decided he must be guilty. Whatever it was, they began to dig not with shovels, but with questions that twisted and turned, with orders that widened their reach, with permissions quietly expanded beyond their original scope. Vaults were opened, storerooms unsealed. The walls themselves began to weep dust as they were tapped, measured, and doubted. Then came the bricks. It began with one corner of the chapter house, where a portion of the wall seemed unusually thick. One of the inspectors ordered a monk to fetch a hammer. The monk hesitated, and that was all they needed. Suspicion bloomed like rot in winter. The hammer was delivered. The bricks were loosened, and behind the stone, they found its silver plates, coins marked with old kings' faces, gold chalices wrapped in cloth to muffle their shine, candlesticks engraved with saints' names, all hidden with care and intention, tucked away as if the abbey itself had known that the crown's fingers would one day reach too far. They did not cheer. They did not smile. They simply wrote, Item 1 silver plate, engraved, of unknown origin. Item 5 goblets, gold, with Latin inscriptions. Item 12 purses of coin, value unknown. Each entry a quiet condemnation, each line a step closer to ruin. The abbey's silence deepened. The bells still rang, but now they sounded like warnings. The monks moved more slowly, their footsteps softer. Meals were eaten without speech, and Richard Whiting, the abbot, returned from his chambers like a man stepping back onto a ship already sinking. He met with the inspectors in private. What was said in that room is not recorded, but afterward, he walked alone in the gardens for many hours, head bowed, hands clasped, as if in conversation with someone only he could hear. The next day, more bricks were pulled, more treasure found, and then, the accusations came not in loud proclamations, but in sealed letters sent quietly to London, to Cromwell's desk, where the ink barely had time to dry before new orders were written. Whiting, it was said, had hidden the king's wealth. He had conspired to keep the abbey's riches from the royal treasury. Some even claimed that writings had been found, documents supporting Queen Catherine, the wife Henry had cast aside, and whose memory still flickered like a half-extinguished candle in certain hearts. It no longer mattered whether it was true. The abbot had signed the Act of Supremacy. The monks had sworn loyalty. The abbey had maintained its duties. But that was no longer enough. In this England, loyalty was not measured by faith or service. It was measured by surrender. And Glastonbury had not surrendered. Whiting was arrested. The inspectors did not bind him themselves. That task was given to soldiers who arrived with a letter sealed in red wax. He did not resist. He handed over his staff, his ring, and the keys to the treasury. He walked out of the abbey not as a leader, but as a prisoner. And as he passed through the cloisters, the monks turned their faces away, not out of fear, but out of reverence. They did not want their last sight of him to be in chains. He was taken to the Tower of London, where his name joined the long list of those who had once stood close to the king and now stood closer to death. In Cromwell's private diary, a line appears: certain person to be sent to the Tower for further examination of the Abbot of Glastonbury. No more was said. No trial date listed. No evidence described. Just the certainty of guilt preordained. But even as Whiting sat in the cold stone of the Tower, back in Glastonbury, the inspectors remained. They combed through ledgers, questioned monks, counted spoons and candles, measured walls and doors. They had become not merely auditors, but executioners of a different kind, the kind who dismantle a soul not by blade, but by inventory. And the gold was taken, boxed, catalogued, sent to the royal coffers where it would be melted, reshaped, and forgotten, but not forgiven. For there was something in the way it had been hidden, not in greed, but in fear, not for profit, but for protection. The abbey had not hoarded it for itself. It had preserved it. Perhaps for the poor who would one day return, for the sacred days that might still come, for the God they still served, even as the king called himself holy. But now it was gone. And so was Richard Whiting. The abbey still stood. The bells still rang. But they rang now for a dead man who had not yet died, and for a faith that was being hollowed out with every blow of the inspector's hammer. The quiet hands had done their work, and the storm, at last, had begun. He was brought to London in silence, and the bells of Glastonbury were still ringing as the cart pulled him away, their echoes following him down the long road like the toll of a requiem that refused to end. The air was heavy with frost, the fields already stripped bare for winter, and the horses moved slowly, as if reluctant to carry such a burden. Richard Whiting, Abbot of Glastonbury, a man who had once ruled over the richest monastery in England, now sat shivering beneath a rough cloak, his wrists bound, his eyes turned not toward heaven, but toward the earth, for he knew that there would be no hearing, no fairness, no mercy, not in the England that Henry VIII had made. The king had found his new church, his new wife, his new gods, and he needed new martyrs to burn beneath them. The Tower of London had received many men before him. It was a place that devoured conscience and reputation alike. Its stones had heard confessions whispered too late, oaths made in terror, and prayers that went unanswered. Whiting entered its gate as others had before him: Thomas More, John Fisher, Anne Boleyn, all of them once proud, and now hollowed by the same unrelenting machine of royal will. He was lodged in a small cell facing the river, the kind of place that left a man too much time to remember what he once was. The guards spoke little to him. They did not need to. His fate was already sealed before he crossed the threshold. Thomas Cromwell's handwriting, sharp and deliberate, had already passed across the parchment that bore his name. The Abbot of Glastonbury to be examined further, to be tried at Glastonbury, and executed there with his accomplices. It was a death warrant disguised as procedure, a formality to dress murder in the robes of justice. The trial itself, if it could be called that, was a pantomime played before an audience that had already left the theater. There would be no defense, no advocate, no mercy petition. His guilt had been written the moment the inspectors found gold in the walls. And his death, decided long before his lips could form a single word in protest. He waited in the tower for weeks that blurred into one another. And perhaps it was a mercy that his body was old and frail, that sleep came easily and memories came slowly. He prayed, though not for deliverance. He prayed for his monks, for the brothers he had left behind, for the abbey that had been his whole world. Somewhere in London, Cromwell was boasting that the last great abbey would soon be tamed. Somewhere in Whitehall, the king was limping through his chambers, his ulcerated leg wrapped in linen, his temper fouled by pain, his conscience dulled by power. The two men, one consumed by ambition and the other by decay, had agreed that the abbot must die, not because of what he had done, but because of what he represented, the last shadow of an England that believed in God before it believed in the king. When the summons finally came, it came not with drums or horns, but with the creak of a door and the quiet command of a warden. Whiting was taken from his cell, placed again upon a cart, and sent back to Glastonbury. The irony must have stung him that he would die not in the capital that condemned him, but at the doorstep of the house he had tended all his life. The journey south was slow. The November air cut through him like thin glass. Villagers along the road did not jeer as they once might have at traders. They stood in silence, hats clutched in hand, for even the simplest of them could see that this was no rebel. This was an old priest, being carried to slaughter by a nation that had lost its soul. The trial convened on the 12th day of November, in the year 1539. Within the walls of his own abbey, the hall was filled not with monks, but with soldiers and royal agents, their boots muddy, their faces set in that blank expression of men who have learned to kill without thinking. The judges, appointed by Cromwell, arrived with papers already signed. There were witnesses, though none who had seen the supposed theft. There was evidence, though none that proved anything beyond the fact that gold had once existed and was now claimed by the crown. The charge, read aloud in the cold air, was absurd: that Richard Whiting, Abbot of Glastonbury, had robbed his own abbey, concealed the king's treasure, and held writings in defense of the late Queen Catherine, an act now called treasonous. He did not protest. What would have been the point? The words had no weight in a room where the verdict was older than the accusation. He listened, hands folded, eyes fixed on the crucifix above the dais. When asked if he had anything to say, he murmured only that he had served God, and in serving God, had never wished harm to his sovereign. The judges did not respond. They did not need to. The sentence was already written. He was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered upon the Tor, the great hill that rose above Glastonbury, like the back of some ancient beast. His two companions, John Thorne and Roger James, were to share his fate. The order was carried out with the same efficiency that marked all of Cromwell's reforms. Soldiers surrounded the abbey. The bells were silenced. The town was warned to attend, for the king wished it known what became of those who defied his supremacy. On the 15th day of November, the cart rolled again through the streets, carrying 3 men bound in rope and iron. Whiting's hair was white, his face thin, but his spine remained straight. As the cart climbed the slope toward the Tor, the crowd followed: peasants, merchants, children clutching their mothers' skirts. Some crossed themselves. Some wept. A few shouted prayers. No one dared curse the king. At the summit, the gallows waited, black against the pale sky. The air smelled of frost and smoke. The executioner stood ready, his apron already stained from other duties. Whiting was made to kneel. He tried to pray, but the wind stole his words. The first rope was looped around his neck, and for a moment, the old man lifted his eyes toward the abbey below. Perhaps he was not seeing the stones or the towers, but the memory of them as they once were lit by candles, filled with song, alive with faith. Then the horse was driven forward, and his body rose into the air, swinging gently in the cold morning light. It might have ended there, mercifully. But mercy was no longer an English virtue. He was cut down before death could take him. His body, still trembling, was laid upon a table. The crowd looked away as the executioner began the second act of the ritual. It was done methodically, without malice, as one performs a duty learned by repetition. When it was finished, the body was divided, head taken clean, limbs severed. His head was nailed to a spike and raised above the west gate of the abbey. His arms and legs were sent to Wells, Bath, Ridgewater, and Ilchester, to hang at crossroads as warnings. The trial had been an illusion. The justice, a shadow. What remained was only the example, the message written in flesh for all to read. And yet, in that moment, England learned something its king could never control, that a man may die without resistance, and still win a kind of victory that no decree can erase. When night fell, the wind swept across the tor, carrying with it the scent of ash and earth. The crowd dispersed. The soldiers marched away, and silence reclaimed the hill. Below, in the ruined abbey, the remaining monks knelt in the dark. Their prayers whispered into the emptiness where their abbot's voice had once been. Above them, his head looked down from the gate, pale and still, framed by the stars that no law could touch. The trial had never been heard, and the sentence had been written long before the crime. Yet in that silence, in that small and terrible space between death and remembrance, something older than kings remained a faith, not in Rome, nor in Henry, but in the quiet endurance of the soul. And though the name of Richard Whiting would fade from the king's ledgers, it would live in the whispers of those who still dared to pray when the crown commanded them to be silent. Dawn came late that day, as if the sun itself hesitated to rise over Glastonbury, reluctant to witness what England had become. A pale mist rolled down from the tor and crept across the meadows, swallowing the fields, the hedgerows, the stones of the abbey, until the whole valley seemed caught between waking and dream. From within that fog, the first creak of wooden wheels broke the stillness. A cart, drawn by 2 horses, bearing 3 men and the weight of a nation's sin. The road from the abbey to the hill was not long, yet it stretched endlessly beneath the cart's slow advance. The horses moved without rhythm, their breath steaming in the cold, their hooves muffled by mud. Soldiers walked beside them, halberds resting on their shoulders, eyes fixed ahead, unwilling to look at the men they escorted. Behind them came townsfolk, drawn not by cruelty but by fear, fear of what might be whispered if they stayed behind, their fear of what would happen to their own souls if they looked away. They came quietly, wrapped in cloaks, their faces half hidden by the fog. No one spoke. Even the children were silent. In the cart sat Richard Whiting, the Abbot of Glastonbury, wrapped in a thin cloak that fluttered with every gust of wind. His hands, bound loosely before him, rested on his knees. His eyes were open but distant, as though seeing not the road, but the years that had led him here, the decades of devotion, the slow work of building, the endless prayers that had once filled his abbey with light. His body, frail with age, bent slightly under the cold, but his expression did not waver. He had not slept that night, nor the night before. There was no sleep left in him, only waiting. Beside him were two monks, John Thorne and Roger James, their faces pale, their lips moving silently in prayer. They did not look at the abbot, though their shoulders trembled each time the cart jolted over a stone. They had confessed to nothing. There was nothing to confess. Their crime, like his, was faith, the old faith, the quiet one, the faith that had lived in these hills long before Henry VIII had decided that the crown could sit higher than the cross. The fog thickened as they passed through the town. The bells did not ring. Cromwell had ordered them silenced. Doors stayed shut. Windows dark. Yet behind the shutters, faces watched the wives of men who had once worked the abbey lands, the widows who had begged at its gates, the orphans who had been fed from its kitchens. They watched as their abbot passed by, and though no voice was raised, though no protest was spoken, the grief that filled those unseen rooms was its own kind of requiem. When the road began to climb, the horses slowed, their hooves slipping on wet earth. The soldiers pushed the cart from behind, grunting with effort, their breath rising in clouds. Above them, the Tor loomed, black and formless in the mist, its summit lost to the gray sky. The gallows had been built the previous night, rough wood, still damp from rain, its rope stiff and new. It stood like a broken finger pointing upward, accusing the heavens. As they neared the crest, the fog began to thin, revealing the outline of the crowd. Hundreds had gathered: peasants, traders, soldiers, priests forming a ring around the gallows. They made no sound as the cart approached. Even the wind seemed to falter. Somewhere beyond, a single crow called, and its cry was swallowed by the hill. The cart stopped. The soldiers stepped aside. A man in a dark cloak, holding a parchment, cleared his throat and began to read. His voice carried across the hill. Sharp and hollow: Richard Whiting, late Abbot of Glastonbury, convicted of robbery and treason, sentenced by His Majesty's order to be hanged, drowned, and quartered upon this place for the example of others. The words were memorized, the man's tone flat, practiced. He did not look at the condemned. When he finished, he folded the paper, tucked it inside his sleeve, and nodded to the executioner. Whiting rose slowly. Helped by one of the guards, his knees shook, but his face remained calm. He turned to his companions. "Be of good heart, my brothers," he said softly, his voice barely more than breath. "For we suffer not as thieves, but as servants of God. What is taken from us this day, He will return in His time." The younger monk began to weep, and Whiting reached out to steady him, his bound hands trembling. Then he lifted his gaze toward the town below, where the abbey's broken towers stood half hidden in fog. For a moment, his lips moved in silent prayer, and those who stood close swore later that they saw his eyes glisten not with fear, but with pity for the England that had forgotten its soul. The rope was placed around his neck. He did not resist. The crowd shifted, a murmur rippling through them like wind through reeds. The executioner, a broad man with scarred hands, hesitated just for an instant, then kicked the cart forward. The rope snapped taut. The abbot's body lifted, hung suspended against the gray sky, turning slowly in the wind. His hands clenched once, then stilled. It should have ended there. Any mercy, even cruel mercy, would have ended it there. But this was not mercy. This was spectacle. When he was cut down, his body was still warm. The executioner worked quickly, his face expressionless. The hill that had once been holy became an altar of desecration. The first cut was made. The smoke of burning entrails mingled with the cold mist, rising like incense to a god who did not answer. The crowd shifted again. Some looked away. Some crossed themselves, despite the risk. A few fainted. None spoke. When it was done, the abbot's head was taken and raised, for all to see. The executioner's arm trembled, perhaps from fatigue, perhaps from something deeper. The face, even in death, was calm, the mouth slightly open, as if still forming a prayer. The limbs were then divided, wrapped in sackcloth, and prepared for the journey to the towns where they would hang as warnings. The soldiers gathered the remains, but the earth refused them. The ground beneath the gallows was slick with blood, yet the soil did not drink it. It pooled, dark and shining, as though the hill itself recoiled. And when the wind rose again, it carried the scent of that blood down through the valley, over the roofs, into the empty courtyards of the abbey. The monks still hiding there said later that they smelled it in the cloisters for days, that it clung to the stones, that no prayer could wash it away. As dusk fell, the cart rolled once more, this time bearing only fragments. The crowd dispersed slowly, their footsteps muffled, their eyes lowered. The soldiers left torches burning at the gallows, their flames flickering like small defiant hearts against the cold sky. And in the town below, no one spoke of what had been seen. Mothers gathered their children, fathers barred their doors, and in the silence that followed, the only sound was the wind moving through the reeds by the river, whispering what no one dared to say aloud, that something sacred had been murdered upon that hill, and that England itself had changed. Later that night, as the moon rose behind thin clouds, a shepherd crossing the fields stopped and looked up at the tor. He swore he saw a faint glow at its summit, like candlelight, and 3 shadows standing where the gallows had been. He watched until the light faded, and the hill returned to darkness. He never spoke of it again, but he remembered the scent of the air iron, smoke, and something sweet, like myrrh. By morning, the soldiers had gone, and frost had settled over the ground. The blood had not sunk in. It lay on the surface, dark and frozen, marking the spot where the last Abbot of Glastonbury had fallen. The wind carried no sound now. No prayer, no cry. Only the silence of a kingdom that had hanged its own faith upon a rope and called it justice. They carried the head down the hill before dawn, wrapped in a cloth that had once been white, but now bore the deep rust of blood. And when they reached the west gate of Glastonbury Abbey, the men did not pause. They moved with the practiced movements of those who had done this before. But even they could not meet the face as they pulled back the cloth, as they drove the spike through bone, as they lifted what had once spoken blessings and raised it high above the gatehouse wall. The eyes were closed, the lips slightly parted. The wind stirred the gray hair that clung to the temples like smoke after fire, and when they stepped back, there was no speech, no proclamation, just the head of Richard Whiting, last Abbot of Glastonbury, watching over the ruins of the house he had served until his final breath. It remained there for days, weeks. No one knew who had been ordered to take it down, or if any order had been given at all. Some said it was left as a warning. Others whispered that even the king had forgotten it. But for the people of Somerset, for the monks who passed beneath it each morning, for the villagers who lowered their eyes when they walked by the western gate, it became something more than a relic of violence. It became a wound carved into stone and sky. It bled not blood, but silence. At first, the birds circled it. Then they avoided it. Mothers turned their children's faces away. Merchants walked the long way around, and those who looked upon it too long found themselves staring not at a man, but at a memory, that of a country that had once prayed with both hands open, not clenched into a fist. The crown had given orders. The church had changed its shape. The monks had scattered. But this quiet head on a pole remained like a question no one dared ask. The limbs had been sent away, carried in carts to Wells, to Bath, to Bridgewater, and to Ilchester. They were nailed to gates, displayed in town squares, left to swing in the wind above the markets, where children sold bread and old women carried buckets of water. In each town, they told the same story, that a traitor had been punished, that the king had eyes even in abbeys, that gold belonged to the throne and not to God. But the faces of the people told another story, and it was not told with words. In Bath, a woman placed a flower beneath the limb nailed above the bridge. No one stopped her. In Wells, a priest crossed himself at midnight beneath the hanging flesh, whispering prayers too, ancient for the new order. In Bridgewater, a shoemaker's apprentice wept when he saw the torn hem of a monastic robe still clinging to the body. And in Ilchester, an old monk, long thought dead, appeared in the square and fell to his knees. But it was the silence that spread most quickly. Not rebellion, not riot, just silence. A quiet that moved through England like mist. In abbeys that remained, the bells rang softer. In churches, sermons shortened. In villages, people crossed themselves behind shutters. The king had demanded obedience, and he had been given it, but with it came something he had not asked for. Something no sword could pierce, and no law could command a nation that no longer trusted its own reflection. For if a man could serve for 60 years, feed the poor, bury the dead, offer the sacraments in the name of God and King, and still end with his head on a pole and his belly opened before the crowd, then what was the value of loyalty? What was the shape of justice? What did it mean to belong to anything at all in Whitehall? Henry VIII did not speak of the execution again. Cromwell, whose ink had signed the orders, soon faced his own reckoning. In time, he too would be dragged through the streets, and his head would roll from the same block that had drunk the blood of queens and courtiers. The king who had demanded the destruction of Glastonbury would, in the end, be buried not in a cathedral but in a swollen, stinking body no physician could save. But in Glastonbury, the abbey did not vanish overnight. Its walls remained, its stones remembered, and beneath its western gate, children grew up in the shadow of the pole where the abbot's head had once been. They did not speak of it, but they did not forget. The silence followed them. It became the lullaby they whispered to their own children. It became the air inside the church when the new prayers were said. It became the pause between chimes, the hesitation before lighting a candle, the breath held too long in a pew. It followed monks into hiding, nuns into exile, priests into disguises, and it followed kings into sleep, where the ghosts of abbots whispered through the walls. The crown had taken the gold, But the hill had kept the blood, and the land, though broken, remembered. Not all of them fled, even after the head was gone and the limbs scattered to the corners of Somerset. Even after the soldiers had ridden out, and the gates had been left swinging in the wind like broken arms. Even after the king's seal had been pressed into the wax of final confiscation, a few of the brothers remained. They moved like shadows through the wreckage of their home, cloaked not in robes now, but in silence, wearing the ash of memory rather than the linen of prayer. They had been ordered to disband. They had been told their order no longer existed, that the rule of Saint Benedict had no place in the New England where God spoke with the king's voice and bled gold when called upon. But still, a few stayed. Not out of rebellion, not even out of hope. They stayed because they did not know how to be anything else. They swept the cloisters. They tended what remained of the gardens. They patched the broken walls where they could put. There was no mass, no sacraments. The relics were gone. The altar stripped. The books hauled away by men who could not read the Latin in their pages. The library, once the crown of the abbey's soul, had been emptied in a single morning, manuscripts stacked like firewood, holy texts sold for shillings or burned for warmth by officers who laughed as they fed the flames. Still, the monks returned each morning to the ruined scriptorium, sat at the splintered desks, and stared at their hands as if trying to remember what they were once made to do. No bells rang. The king had forbidden it. The sound of their old life, its rhythm, its spine was gone. The bell tower stood empty. Its ropes rotted. Its great bronze tongue silenced like a throat cut too deep. Once, those bells had marked the hours of prayer, the rising of the sun, the turning of seasons, the passage of souls from this world into the next. Now, their absence marked everything else. The failure, the fear, the death that had come not only for bodies, but for faith itself. The wind passed through the belfry with a hollow whistle. Like a voice calling out in a language, no one spoke anymore. They did not sing, not aloud, but in the early hours, just before dawn, when the mist returned to the fields and the frost hung from the stone like breath frozen in midair. Some said they could hear the faintest echo of the old chants. No words, only tone, the kind of sound that slipped between dream and waking, a humming in the dark, a whisper remembered only by the stones. Food was scarce. The villagers, once fed by the abbey's generosity, were now starving themselves. The king had taken the grain stores. The fields had been parceled and sold. Where once carts had arrived heavy with fruit, cheese, honey, and bread, there now came only silence and the brittle rustle of dry weeds. The monks foraged. They drank thin broth made from roots and water. Sometimes, a loaf would appear on the steps at night, wrapped in cloth with no name, placed by hands too cautious to be seen. And yet, they endured. They endured not because they believed the abbey would be restored. That dream had died with the abbot. They endured because endurance was all they had left. Because in a world that no longer allowed them to pray as monks, they could still suffer as men. And suffering, in its own terrible way, had always been a form of communion. They spoke rarely. Silence had become both habit and shield. But when they did speak, it was with great care. Like men unearthing relics from beneath rubble, they did not say the abbot's name. They did not mention the tor or the gallows. These things had become too large for language. Instead, they spoke of the garden's frost, or the repairs to the cloister roof, or the old dog that still lingered near the gate, whining some nights as if waiting for someone who would never return. There was no formal dissolution ceremony. No candles extinguished one by one. No final procession. The abbey did not end. It faded. Slowly. Like light, leaving a room. Like breath leaving a dying man. One brother fell ill in early winter. There were no medicines left. And no one came when they sent for help. He died in a cold cell, holding a scrap of parchment from a psalm he had once copied with trembling hands. Another vanished into the woods one night and was never seen again. The others took this, not as abandonment, but as a kind of mercy. Spring came without celebration. The apple trees flowered anyway. The bees returned. The birds nested beneath the eaves of the ruined chapel, chirping above the broken altar, where once the Eucharist had been lifted with trembling reverence. The world moved on. Indifferent. But inside the abbey, time had stopped. The monks moved through each hour, as though it were the same hour, repeated endlessly beneath a sky that no longer watched. And yet, in the deepest part of the abbey, in a corner that had not yet been ransacked, there remained one small candle, hidden behind a loose stone. It was lit once a week, for a few minutes only, by a hand that never revealed its owner. No mass, no rite, just the flame, and the silence, and a breath drawn carefully between memory and defiance. A flicker of something that refused to die completely. Years passed. The monks aged, one by one. They left not to escape, but to vanish. The abbey continued to crumble. The ivy returned. Rain pooled in the cloisters. The stone stairs collapsed in one wing. Pilgrims stopped coming. Children were warned not to enter. The place became a story, then a ruin, then a question. But the silence remained. It was not the silence of defeat, nor the silence of reverence. It was the silence of something unfinished. The silence of a prayer that had been interrupted, but not forgotten. And long after the last monk walked out into the night and did not return, long after the crown had sold the last of the lands and marked the abbey as property of the state, long after new priests said new prayers in new churches, built of the very stones that once formed Glastonbury's sacred walls, the silence still clung to the air. Visitors would come. Years later, some seeking ghosts, some seeking God, and when they stood in the center of the old nave, where the altar had once risen in golden light, they would find themselves holding their breath without knowing why. Because even ruins can remember. Because even broken bells still echo in the bones of those who heard them. Because even silence, when it endures long enough, becomes a voice of its own. And Glastonbury Abbey, though dead, and still spoke. Just not in words. There are some places where the wind never forgets what it has heard. Where it carries not just the scent of moss and stone and broken branches, but voices, soft ones, low ones, voices that no longer belong to any throat. Glastonbury Abbey became such a place. In time, the walls gave way to ivy. The roofs caved in under rain. The great arches stood exposed like ribs of a giant, buried just beneath the skin of England. But the wind still moved through the ruins with purpose. It still turned corners like a man in procession. It still paused at the broken altar, as if bowing. And when it sighed through the empty cloisters, there were those who swore they heard the sound of a robe brushing against stone, or the barest murmur of prayer from lips no longer there. The villagers spoke little of it. Glastonbury had become a shadow that stretched beyond the abbey grounds. The children grew up playing among stones whose names they did not know, climbing fallen pillars, chasing one another through the hollow nave, laughing where once men knelt in Latin sorrow. But even they grew quiet sometimes without knowing why. Something in the air would change. A sudden stillness. A cold breath down the back of the neck, A moment when the sun dimmed, though no cloud passed before it. And in that moment, the games would stop, and small feet would retreat down the hill, and the ruins would be left alone again. Some said it was the abbot, not the man whose blood had been burned and scattered, whose head had hung above the gate, like a warning no one dared read, but something of him that had remained behind. Not in anger, not to haunt or harm, but simply because he had never learned how to leave. They said he was seen most often near the garden, a cloaked figure bending over soil that no longer bloomed, or along the cloisters, moving slowly, as if still inspecting the grounds, still caring for what had already been taken. No one ever saw his face, but they knew it was him. The quiet, the grace in the step, the way he paused at certain doors that were now only empty frames. It was not terror he brought, but sadness profound, unspoken, the kind that draws tears without sound. Once, a soldier stationed in the area came to the ruins on a dare. Young, drunk, full of the swagger that makes men foolish. He shouted beneath the tower, laughed into the dark. When he emerged an hour later, his face was white as frost, his eyes wide. He spoke only once of what he'd seen. To a priest, whose name was never written down. He was praying. The soldier whispered, "Just praying." But he looked at me like I'd been gone 1,000 years. Over time, the sightings faded. Or perhaps the people simply stopped speaking of them. England moved forward. New kings came. New Vars. New faiths. The abbey remained. But as relic. Not sanctuary. Stone for artists. Study for antiquarians. Curiosity for travelers. Few remembered the man who had died there, let alone the life he had lived before that final morning on the tour. But the wind remembered. The stones remembered. And sometimes, just sometimes, so did the world. On the anniversary of his death, strange things were known to happen. Not loud things, not theatrical, but subtle. A candle that wouldn't stay lit. A bird that landed on the same broken wall and stayed until dusk. Rain that fell only on the abbey grounds while the town stayed dry. Once, a choir passing through the region stopped to rest within the nave and found themselves singing without meaning to. Their voices joining in perfect harmony. Though none of them knew the hymn. They left quickly. One girl wept the entire way home. No one claimed the ghost. No church recorded him. No king repented. His name did not return to the rolls of martyrs or saints. He remained a silence. A presence. A kindness that had been betrayed but had refused to vanish. He was not vengeance. He was memory. And the wind faithful. Quiet. Constant carried him. It moved through the reeds by the river where monks once walked in meditation. It crept beneath the floorboards of cottages built with stones stolen from the abbey. It stirred the branches of the apple trees whose roots had been tended by monastic hands. It whispered through keyholes, through ruined chapels, through windows that faced nothing but sky. To those who had ears for such things, it said he stayed. He stayed because the land had no voice. He stayed because no one else would remember. He stayed because faith, once lived fully, does not leave the place it grew. And so Glastonbury never belonged entirely to history. It lived in two times at once in the ruin, and in the man who would not let the ruin forget its purpose, and though his body had been broken, and scattered, and erased, though his name had been omitted from sermons and censored from scrolls, something of Richard Whiting endured not in the world of power, not in the mouth of kings, but in the soft hum of the wind that still moved, without ceasing, through the stones, No monument marked him. No grave held his bones. But his ghost wore no chains. It walked free beneath the sky, and to those who dared stand long enough in the shadow of the broken abbey, to those who stood still and quiet and listened not to the wind, but to what moved just behind it, he sometimes came. A presence, a breath, the last Abbot of Glastonbury, who could not be silenced. There are stories we tell before sleep that are meant to soothe, and there are others quieter, slower, heavier that ask us not to forget. They are not stories of heroes or villains. Not really. They are the stories that linger at the edge of history, where memory slips into silence, and the names are almost lost. This is one of those stories. It is not about a rebellion. It is not about a war. It is about an old man who prayed too long, who believed too quietly, who stayed when others left, and who, in staying, it gave England something it never asked, for a reflection it could not bear to see. He was born before the first cracks appeared in the crown, before kings began to trade wives like titles and cardinals like coins. He grew up among the chants and the candle smoke, where learning meant humility, and power meant service, and every breath was shaped by prayer. He became a man not by sword, but by silence, and when he was asked to lead, he did not rise like a lion, but stepped forward like a steward, careful, patient, faithful. They made him abbot. They gave him keys. He fed the poor. He soothed the sick. He answered every cruel winter with the warmth of his own hand. For decades, he served not just the abbey but the land around it. To the villagers, he was not father or lord. He was simply there. The man who never closed his gate. The man who never forgot the names of the dead. And then came the king. The king who rewrote heaven with a crown. The king who split the body of the church as easily as a scroll. The king who demanded that gold bow first, and God follow after. The abbot tried to comply. He signed what they asked. He held his tongue. He turned his eyes downward. But he would not lie. He would not pretend. He would not make his monastery a marketplace, or let it be emptied like a pocket. And when the inspectors came, when the walls were opened, and the hidden gold spilled like secrets, too long held, he did not flee. He did not plead. He stood, and in the end, that was enough. They called it treason. They called it theft. They called it justice. But history knows what it was. It was a message carved into flesh. It was a silence broken not by guilt, but by example. It was the king placing one hand on the altar and the other on the gallows, and calling both divine. They took him to the hill. They broke him. They scattered him. They left no tomb, no cross, no grave. And yet he remains, not in marble, not in stained glass, but in air, in shadow, in the breath before the bell. The monks are gone. The bells do not ring. The abbey is hollow, a cathedral of ghosts. But when you walk there slowly, gently, without speaking, you feel it. Not fear, not grief, but presence, a kind of waiting, a memory that has forgotten how to end. They say the head was displayed for weeks. They say the limbs were nailed in markets. They say the king smiled. But none of that matters now. What matters is that the old man did not ask to be remembered. And still, he is. He lives in the way the grass grows differently where the altar once stood. In the way the wind changes tone when you step beneath the broken arch. In the way no historian can quite explain why Glastonbury's ruin feels heavier than all the others. Because some stories were never meant to be victories. Some stories exist only so that the soul of a place does not vanish. He died without a tomb, but the land became his grave, and the silence became his epitaph. And the kingdom that killed him, it marched on richer, louder, blinder. It crowned more kings. It burned more prayers. It wrote laws in blood and called them progress. But beneath it all, something had shifted. A crack, a sorrow, a scar. Because England did not just hang a monk. It buried its heart. And hearts, once buried, do not return easily. So if you ever go to Glastonbury, do not speak loudly, do not walk quickly, and do not bring questions. Bring bread, bring silence, bring time, and perhaps, if the wind is kind, and the ruins have not forgotten your breath, you will feel him just for a moment, not as ghost, but as prayer, one that has waited 500 years to be heard. Good night, and may your sleep remember what history has tried to forget. They tied his frail body to a wooden hurdle, not with care or pity, but with the same cold detachment one might show a sack of grain bound for market. And as the old man was dragged through the mud and gravel streets of Glastonbury, the townspeople watched in a silence that weighed heavier than any sermon ever preached within the abbey's ancient walls. For this was no thief, no murderer, no rebel prince. This was Richard Whiting, a man of God, nearly 80 years of age, whose only crime was holding fast to the stones and silence of a sacred place, and whose fate, on that cold November morning in the year 1539, I would stain the land with more than blood. It would stain it with shame that centuries would not wash away. He had once been the voice of peace in a realm unraveling, chosen by his brothers not through ambition, but reverence. When in the year 1525, the old abbot died, and a replacement was needed to guide the great Glastonbury Abbey, a place whose history reached back through centuries, a place older than kings, richer than barons, and holier, perhaps, than any crown. And so they chose Richard, quiet and devout, a man more likely to kneel than to command. Yet under his careful hand, the abbey had flourished, its monks fed, its lands managed with grace, and its name whispered with respect in both village hearths and noble halls. For Glastonbury was not merely a monastery, it was a symbol, a sanctuary, and for some, even a final thread that connected England to the holy past. But the king was changing everything. Henry VIII of his name, who had once stood tall as defender of the faith, now stood in direct defiance